Hey everybody, welcome back to Canada's Boxing Channel. So, as promised, I have completed my list of the top 10 heavyweights of all time, going back to the days of John L. Sullivan. Now, there's actually 11, not 10. My methodology or metrics, one of the fellows from Porky's Corner asked me about what metrics I was using, and I explained to him, and so of course I'll explain on the channel. What I did is I looked at combined championship reigns and I assigned a numerical value to that. I looked at individual reigns and assigned a numerical value to that. So for example, the longest individual reign, for example, Joe Louis, you give that a value of 100, and then everybody else's reign in days becomes a percentage of that. The biggest fight they ever had requires a bit of reading, a bit of history study, and a bit of subjective evaluation. So, for example, does the rematch against Max Schmeling, with the weight of the nation upon his shoulders and the weight of his race, remember the time it took place, is that given a higher numerical value than, for example, the fight of the century when Muhammad Ali fought Joe Frazier? Since I wasn't alive during both fights, I have to remember in one case, and of course also spend time going back over how many people were there, what sort of social impact it had, etc. And I have to read about the other fight and draw from sources that were there. And then you make an evaluation, right? Quality of opponents, and that can be, how many people who the fighter beat became Hall of Famers themselves, what were their records like, what were they thought to be like. If you go back, you've got to really rely upon kind of peer review. Because, of course, we can see what George Foreman was like. We know who he fought, we can figure all this out. But if we go back to Jack Johnson, we have to rely upon what we're being told by people who were there at the time. And that's where you've got to go to your books, and you've got to go to the views of people who were respected, who commented upon. So it becomes much more difficult. Public impact or societal impact is probably the hardest one to gauge. And all these, of course, are given numerical values, right? So, for example, was the influence that Jack Dempsey had on the society that he lived in greater than the influence of, say, Deontay Wilder? Deontay Wilder does not make this list. If you're a Deontay Wilder fan, you will be disappointed. Just as an example. And then I assigned values to firsts. So, for example, George Foreman gets some points for being the oldest. Jack Johnson gets points for being the first African American. Rocky gets points for being the undisputed. Ali would get points for being the first 3-time lineal championship. Lennox might get points for being the last undisputed in a certain era. So I ended up with a whole bunch of papers, all of which had a whole bunch of numbers on them. And then I tabulated the numbers to come up with 11 people. I was surprised in doing this exercise that it challenged a lot of my own prejudices. I don't mean prejudice in a sort of a real negative sense, but that things that I thought I knew, I didn't know, as it were. Remember, I grew up in the 1970s watching boxing, right? So my prejudice is to the golden era of heavyweight boxing. And so one's tempted to sort of list off 10 guys who were active during that time almost. And of course, there is a natural prejudice to favor fighters who you've seen, who were active during your lifetime. And I went through that exercise the other day. And when it comes to going back to fighters, not just of my father's generation, but of my grandfather's generation, it becomes really hard. The style was different. The actual sport in many respects was different. And the physiques of the fighters were different. But remember, this is not a fantasy fight league. It is quite possible to find a fighter not on this list who could beat anybody on this list. That is not the object of the exercise. If you're looking for fantasy fight league stuff, you're going to have to go and look somewhere else, right? Because this is not about that. This is about the record of the individuals, who they fought, their biggest fights, the social impact, public acceptance, legacy, those sorts of things. Whether they added to the sport. A little bit like, if you're a golf fan, Arnold Palmer was never the greatest golfer ever. But he brought golf to the TV age. And so if I was preparing a list of the top 10 golfers, Arnold Palmer might well have a spot because of the influence they have. So hopefully that helps. I'm going to put this into 2, possibly 3 parts. And I'm going to go in reverse order. And I'm going to try and cap each video at around that 20-minute mark. So number 11 on my list is an individual who started it all. The individual is none other than the Boston strong boy, John L. Sullivan. Now, John L. was born in 1858. And he passed away on February the 2nd, 1918. Known, quite simply, as the Boston Strong Boy, he scores 442 points. Number 1, by the way, scores 772 points. I will add one thing. In the middle, you can just, it's a pick'em. Because 1 point separates numbers 6, 7, and 8. So don't get mad at me. You can put them in reverse order if you like. Okay, back to John L. Sullivan. He was recognized as the first heavyweight champion of the gloved boxing era, reigning from February the 2nd, 1882 until September the 7th, 1892. It's a 10-year span. He was also generally recognized as the last heavyweight champion of bare knuckle boxing under the London prize ring rules. He was a cultural icon of 19th century America. Arguably, he was the first boxing superstar. He was also one of the highest paid athletes of his era. Newspapers covered his career, and they often had as headlines the latest accounts of his championship fights. You could say that John L. Sullivan kind of gave birth to what we call today sports journalism. And he also set a pattern for covering boxing internationally. Sullivan was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1990 as a member of the Hall's original class of inductees. The theoretical record, and as you go back in history, as we know, these are almost meaningless, was 47 wins, 1 loss, and 2 draws, with 38 wins by knockout. Many sources disagree with this. Many sources say there were many, many, many more fights. Interestingly, the barn where Sullivan trained still stands in the small town of Belfast, New York, and is now the Bare Knuckle Boxing Hall of Fame. He, as I say, took part in the last bare knuckle fight against Jake Kilrain. 75 rounds. You know, that's a modern fighter's career, right? He lost the title to James J. Corbett in 1892. So, John L. Sullivan doesn't make my top 10, but he gets a very honourable mention as number 11. And I think that's fitting. The guy who started it all, right? You know, we say, back to the days of John L. Well, you can't really say that unless you include John L. Sullivan in your list. That's my view. So, there we go. I decided to make it 11, and he is number 11. Number 10 is Rocky Marciano. I have done a complete video on Rocky Marciano. It's on this channel. Please go and look at it for more details. And like I say, with all of these fighters, please go and do your own looking up of the fighters if you're not familiar with them. If they're more modern day fighters, go look at their fights online. Go buy books, read books about these guys. Pass the knowledge on to younger or less well-informed fans so that we all appreciate all these fighters and we don't buy into narratives that are thrown down our throats that the latest fighter is the best ever, because it's simply not true. Okay? So we owe it to ourselves to inform ourselves and inform others. Anyways, Rocco Francis Marciano, who became known, of course, as Rocky Marciano, and apologies to anybody who's Italian because I'm absolutely certain that I didn't pronounce that original name correctly, but I did my best. He was an American professional boxer who competed from 1947 to 1955. He held the World Heavyweight Championship from 52 to 56. The reason that Rocky is really on this list is he remains the only heavyweight champion to finish his entire professional career undefeated. His 6 title defenses were against Jersey Joe Walcott, who he actually took the title off in the first place, Roland La Starza, Ezzard Charles, who he beat twice, Don Cockle, and Archie Moore. Marciano holds a record with heavyweight Brian Nielsen for the longest undefeated streak by a heavyweight. He's also the only world heavyweight champion to go undefeated throughout his professional career. Gene Tunney never suffered a defeat at heavyweight and retired as champion. However, he lost one career fight at light heavyweight, and his longest streak was 32, with his overall record being 82-1-4. Marciano has the highest knockout percentage of any heavyweight champion in history over the period of his career, with 87.76% of Rocky's opponents going night-night. In his professional career, he was only knocked down twice. The first occurred in his first title fight against Jersey Joe Walcott, and the second against Archie Moore. Now, some people criticize Rocky for the relatively low quality of opposition he faced during his career. However, over the years, people have recognized that he did achieve lots of notable wins. He also beat Joe Louis on Joe Louis's comeback. Not the Joe Louis of the days of the 1930s or 1940s, but nevertheless a Joe Louis who still had some gas in the tank. In fact, he retired Joe Louis. In December 1962, a ring poll of 40 boxing experts placed Marciano as the 7th best heavyweight of all time. Boxing historian Charlie Rose rated Marciano as the 8th best heavyweight of all time in '68. And in 1971, the founder of Ring magazine, Nat Fleischer, named Marciano the 10th all-time greatest heavyweight champion. So he's number 10 on my list. He retired young, he retired undefeated, and of course, his record is 49-0. Rocky, unfortunately, was killed in a plane crash in 1969, which again speaks to legacy. What I found is that the longer a champion lived, they had a greater period of time to build on their legacy with, after their careers were well over. A good example would be Jack Dempsey. Jack Dempsey, well into his 60s, was still, an after-dinner speaker and stuff like that. And it builds upon his record. Rocky, unfortunately, died in a plane crash. When I was a kid, the expression was, it took a mountain to defeat the Rock. Apparently his plane flew into a mountain. Now, number 9 came as a surprise to me. I was not expecting number 9 to be on the list at all. And that is the Boilermaker, Jim Jeffries, who lived from 1875 to 1953. He was known for his enormous strength and stamina, and he used a technique that was taught to him by his former welterweight and middleweight champion, who was his trainer, Tommy Ryan. Jeffries fought out of a crouch with his left arm extended forward, and he was able to absorb tremendous punishment while wearing his opponents down. He was 225, 6'1.5". Apparently he could run 100 yards in just over 10 seconds and could high jump over 6 feet. He was a natural left-hander, so even though he boxed out of an orthodox stance, he was a natural left-hander, like Henry Cooper. And so he had one-punch knockout power in his left hook. His lead hand was his power hand. Writer Jack London coined the phrase "Great White Hope" to describe Jeffries in his attempt to win the heavyweight crown from African-American world champion Jack Johnson. Now, of course, Jim Jeffries had retired, and he was lured out of retirement to fight Jack Johnson. Didn't want to come back, but there was so much pressure to come back and dethrone the first African-American champion, who was thought to be an affront to white America, that there was public outcry for Jeffries to come off the ranch, to come back and to fight, which of course he eventually did, though he did not prevail. And that was the fight. And both Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries get extra points for this, for taking part in it. That was the first prize fight to be billed as Fight of the Century in 1910. Now today, the legacy of Jim Jeffries is mostly forgotten. When I was going through all the champions of history, and as the numbers were showing that Jim Jeffries was rising high, I'm like, I got to go do some more reading, because it was a surprise to me. He was once considered one of the greatest heavyweight champions of all time. So I'm going to read some testimonials from great fighters who spoke about Jim Jeffries. It was an illumination for me. Jack Root, Willie Ritchie, and Tommy Burns rated Jeffries as the greatest heavyweight ever. James J. Corbett said of Jeffries, "The thing that always impressed me was the speed the youngster had, and he weighed 225 pounds. I hold that Jeffries was the greatest heavyweight champion of them all." Sam Langford, who I did a video on, the Nova Scotian fellow, who fought from lightweight to heavyweight, advertised to fight any man in the world except Jim Jeffries. Tom Sharkey, who was a top heavyweight contender, thought that Jeffries would have beaten Jack Dempsey and Joe Louis on the same night. He said that Jeffries was strong like a bull and quick on his feet like a cat. Sharkey called Jeffries the greatest fighter of all time. Jack Johnson, who beat Jeffries, stated in an interview with Ring magazine that he thought Jeffries was the greatest. In another interview, he said that Jeffries would have beaten Jack Dempsey. And Jack Dempsey himself said Jim Jeffries was a tough gun. If we could have gotten in the ring together, each at our best, I probably would have had my chin knocked off. Nat Fleischer, founder of the Ring magazine, described Jeffries as one of the most formidable fighting machines the prize ring has ever produced. And the list goes on and on. There is a list of great fighters and boxing historians who rate Jim Jeffries so highly. So Jim Jeffries is number 9 on my list. And Jim Jeffries, like I say, it came as a surprise to me that he was even on the list. So John L. Sullivan had 442 points, Rocky had 451 points, Jim Jeffries had 464 points. And that's where I'm going to leave it. The next video will deal with fighters 8, 7, 6, and 5. Thank you. Stay tuned. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you on the next video.